Affairs, India's oldest foreign policy think tank.
Many people interested in foreign policy have told me when they come to the Indian Council of World Affairs in Sapru House, they feel a great sense of affinity with this institution because this was where the serious study of international relations in India all began.
The ICWA was set up by a small group of public intellectuals some years before our independence because they felt it important that India have an independent perspective on international affairs. Since then, the ICWA has gone from strength to strength, and it has been a long journey, almost 75 years. One particular milestone in that journey was in 2001, when the Indian Parliament passed an act declaring the ICWA to be an institution of national importance. We thus became a publicly funded independent think tank. Our governing council is headed by the Vice President of India, and the External Affairs Minister is its Vice President. We have three focus areas. The first is research, which is carried out by an in-house faculty. Very rigorous research on different parts of the world, encompassing the domain of area studies.
The Council has been very proactive in conducting dialogue and discussion on African affairs and India-Africa relations in order to promote an understanding on African affairs in India, an Indian perspective on Africa, given the priority that now Africa has in Indian foreign policy.
Within the Council, we have a renewed focus on Latin America and the Caribbean region. So we're looking through our studies to find new areas of cooperation such as renewable energy, climate change and the space technology.
Interacting with leading experts, diplomats, media persons and academicians has helped me nurture my research further.
We recently had the ASEAN Indo-Pacific Outlook, which has a lot of convergence with the India's own Indo-Pacific construct.
The learning curve at the Council has been tremendous and it provides a strong foundation for my future research.
The second is policy. Because we are a think tank and being close to policy, commenting on policy and helping formulate policy is an essential part of our functioning.
I think in the new age, what we're seeing much more of is that people want to be involved in foreign policy thinking. They want to have a voice. Now this is where ICWA comes in.
This is the platform where I for many years have come and interacted with the best in the world.
ICWA provides a valued platform for visiting foreign dignitaries to interact with informed Indian audiences. The third is outreach. This is most important because of our role as a public-funded independent think tank, and we carry this out by associating ourselves with as wide an audience in India as is possible. Colleges, universities, other think tanks, and of course with similar institutions elsewhere in the world.
What I would call the democratization of Indian foreign policy. It has moved to distant corners of the country. It is no longer a preserve of Delhi.
ICWA has a robust publications program which includes papers by the in-house faculty, invited papers and commentaries, and books on foreign affairs by not only former diplomats and established academics but also by upcoming scholars. Our journal India Quarterly is being published since 1945. ICWA's publications are also being translated into various Indian languages. What is ICWA's role as we move into the future? The vision of the institution is to stay abreast of all the momentous changes taking place in the domain of foreign policy. New areas are emerging. There are strategic technologies, there is climate change, there is artificial intelligence, and there is cybersecurity. How can our research faculty and the audiences that come here be better informed about developments in these areas? How can we write and formulate research papers to give policy inputs that help in government policy formulation? These are the emerging challenges for ICWA and form a part of our vision for the future.
Good afternoon, all the participants. I am Fazlur Rahman Siddiqui, Research Fellow at the Indian Council of World Affairs. On behalf of the Council, it is my pleasure to welcome you all this afternoon to the online panel discussion on a book titled Syria, the Tragedy of a Pivotal State, authored by Ambassador Rajendra M. Abhyankar. Allow me to brief you about today's program and introduce you to panelists for today's discussion. Today's program will be chaired and moderated by Ambassador V.P. Haran, who has the distinction of serving as our ambassador to Syria, the main theme of today's program. I think no one could have been better than him to chair this occasion because he has not only served in the country but has been an eyewitness to the early days of turmoil in Syria, and hence he, apart from commenting on the books, can enlighten us with what he saw and what future he predicts for Syria. The program will begin by presentation of the book by Ambassador Abhyankar, and his presentation will be followed by the remarks of the chair, Ambassador V.P. Haran. After the remarks of the chair, Dr. Awad will make his own observation about the book. He himself is a Syrian and a senior international independent journalist and a well-known political analyst. Last week only, he has been awarded the prestigious Marwai Studio International Award for Excellence in Journalism. Later, Varghese K. George, Deputy Resident Editor with Hindu, will present his own observation about the book. Finally, Ms. Priya Singh, Deputy Director, Asia and Global Affairs, Kolkata, will give her own account about the book. After that, the chair will moderate Q&A session of about 20 minutes. Now, some rules to be followed here. Question can be asked by typing live in the chat box provided below the video panel. That can be initiated by logging into the chat as a guest option provided at the bottom of the chat window, where you can enter your name and then accept terms and conditions to start chatting. Panelists will respond during the Q&A session, and the moderator will try to take as many questions as possible. It is requested that question and observation should be brief and to the point. Before I invite author of the book, Ambassador Abhyankar, I would also like to say something about the book. The book titled Syria, the Tragedy of a Pivotal State is unique in many ways. After going through the book, one has the feeling that how the history of Syria from ancient time to modern period had been moving so well when the author says, if Iraqis are the Persian of the Arab world, then Syrian are the Belgian of the Arab world. While justifying the title of the book, author tells about why Syria is the pivotal state. It is pivotal because of its enduring history, its contribution to the human civilization in nurturing three great religions, Judaism, Christianity and Islam. It is pivotal state because it is situated on the civilization confluence of four cultures, Arab, Persian, Turkish and Hebrews. It is pivotal state because of the unique, not because of unique past alone, but it is so because it is caught in the middle of the overlapping sphere of influence of multiple great powers. The crisis in Syria has not only swung the country alone, but has led to the trans-border mayhem like refugee crisis, communal violence, disease and destruction and economic degradation. This book is unique in many other ways, like this is a kind of documentation. The author provides a minute detail of all the initiatives taken in the field of peace process, ranging from UN to individual process like Kofi Annan plan, to Saudi plan, and then to Russia, then Iran, then Turkey, and each and everything has been detailed, given such a minute detail of the peace process that I think all the previous account on the Syria is lacking. Now, I would also like to say that the kind of author also gives a kind of scenario building what might happen in Syria given the present scenario. For example, he tells there might be many wars between like Syria and Turkey, between Kurdish forces and Syrian forces, between Turkey and the Kurdish, between Iran. These are my observations about the book. Since time is very limited, so I would end here. Before I invite Ambassador V.P. Haran to chair the proceeding, I would like to request Ambassador Abhyankar, author of the book, to make his presentation. After his presentation, Ambassador V.P. Haran, the chair of the today's program, will make his own observation and then conduct the rest of the proceeding of our today. Thank you very much. Now I would like to request Ambassador Abhyankar to make his presentation.
Thank you very much. I mean, I am happy to do this, but according to the program you sent, my friend Haran was to make some opening remarks. So are we skipping those?
No, I was told that
little bit changes have been made.
They allotted only 5 minutes for me, and they said they shifted it after you, and I've been given 15 minutes.
Fair enough.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
So I will go ahead and I will actually make, let's say, about 6 points in brief, in order that I stick to the time limit given. I would like to actually start with a small point that I saw, that I read in Ambassador Haran's review of my book, where he says that the tendency to view the Syrian unrest in purely sectarian terms betrays a lack of Syria's polity. I 100% agree with that. We are in the 10th year of the Syrian civil war. So what I will try to do is, the first thing is, what is the situation after 10 years of the civil war? Second is, why is Syria important? Some of the reasons have already been mentioned by Dr. Rahman. Then I thought I'll mention about why has President Assad been able to survive. The next is, what is the extent of foreign interference in Syria? Not just the countries, but and this is a point that I have taken from Ambassador Haran's review, is the malign role of the media, international media in Syria, particularly Al Jazeera, which started getting followed by everybody else, but also the Saudi channels like Asharq and NBC. Then, of course, the peace process, where does it stay? And then, what is the latest situation after all this? So, we are in the 10th year of the civil war. What I can quickly say is that this civil war is unique for two reasons. First is the global implication of this civil war for the last whole decade, which is 4 of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council are actually on the ground in Syria with their own interests, and every major regional power is also there by backing various opposing groups, which at one time were more than 1,000 opposing President Assad's government. But in so doing, they have made it impossible to actually deliver any humanitarian assistance or foster ceasefire or peacemaking. Because when the main countries, the permanent 5, if 4 of them are on the ground, what interest will they have in actually doing this? But what Syria has shown is that all the standards that we come to accept in the last 70 years since the Second World War have all been questioned in Syria. More importantly, the cardinal principles of the UN relating to non-interference, relating to respect for national sovereignty, then the right of individual and collective self-defense, then the sanctity of UN Security Council before approving or waging war, which makes it different from Iraq, where there was no UN resolution, and Afghanistan, where it was only the US. But here, at least you have a kind of eventual agreement in 2015 in Resolution 2254. But the right of individual and collective self-defense has again been breached, mainly by Turkey. And there are other UN principles like protection of human rights, protection of civilian populations, and the right of the people to choose their own government. All these they are in complete breach. I mean, all these countries are in complete breach. These are the countries, these are the permanent members who actually gave us all these ideas and put them in the UN Security Council. So this is the first thing. The second is that the Syrian war, Syrian civil war, is a kind of a hybrid religious war because it's both ideological and on the ground, as represented by two votaries of either side, which is Iran and Saudi Arabia. And it is interesting that Syria historically has proven or has provided a battleground for opposing interests to settle their own quarrels, which is something that has happened again and again. And today, those quarrels are still being settled, even between Hezbollah and Israel, between Iran and Israel, between US and Iran, between US and Russia. All this is happening in Syria. But the fact remains that after 10 years, after a whole decade, Bashar Assad has won 90% of his country and 70% of his population. It's only the area of Idlib and Afrin which still remain to be decided. Idlib is going on since, I think, September 18, and with Turkey on the rampage actually in that whole area, it looks like Turkey is trying to assert its own right in deciding the future of this country. Now, why does Syria matter? As Dr. Azur has said, it has nurtured three religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Sits astride four different cultures, and I could see it when I actually traveled from Syria. When I finished my posting there, I was posted to Turkey, and I drove across. And actually, when I crossed the border, you could see that there's clearly a line, not as if it's a smooth transition from one to the other. And the same thing probably applies to the Turkish, Turkish, of course, to the Persian and the Hebrew. At the same time, Syria is a mosaic of ethnically, culturally, and religiously distinct community. And that is what has bred for Syria a sort of secular culture, where secular not in the Indian sense, but secular in the sense that they are welcoming of all the religions that you find in mentioned in the holy books. The next other characteristic of this conflict is that it's a multidimensional conflict. There's sectarian strife, there's also strife arising from socio-economic grievances, class conflict between the rich and the marginalized communities, and ethno-sectarian groups. But what is interesting is that by making religious belief the primary identity marker, it has posed a dilemma between maintaining sectarian diversity while preserving national unity. This is something that it doesn't just apply in Syria, it applies, I think, in India as well. There is a parallel. Now, why did President Assad survive? What was good about all this was that the Ba'athist state structure was efficient. It was, as Dr. Awad said in the last time we were talking, that Syria had the best health system. Syria had basically nobody suffered because of health requirements, because of income, because of food. The army that Syria's army is highly non-politicized. So that's another reason. why the army never took any part as it has in Egypt, for example. Then is a more personal sort of characteristic of President Assad, which is that he has been able to very well outplay regional and international enemies and assert government's sovereignty at each time, even as far as giving, taking or accepting humanitarian assistance is concerned. So his ability to divide his opponents on the diplomatic table and on the battlefield has been excellent. Another very interesting thing that was done in Syria was to constructively use Syria's glory of the past. That is, its museums and archaeological sites have been given great importance, have been a lot of money has been spent, and there are stories of how, for example, the curator at Palmyra was, his name was also Assad, who was actually killed because he would not tell the ISIS exactly where these things were hidden and so on. So, but in the end, what is important is that the ABSP, the Baath Socialist Party, has become a far-reaching instrument of state control of the economy, politics, and society. Because what was required was not brilliance. They wanted people who were largely homogeneous in the way they thought. Now, the two other things that I would mention here is that Syria, in that sense, was responsible for the reversal of the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, as you know, not quite a name that one I like, but let's call them Arab Revolution. But these started in Tunisia and went all the way down. But when they reached Syria, they found that it did not work. For the simple reason that the Arab Revolution failed, because the people who were involved in actually promoting such a change, which was understandable because people in most countries want a say in what is going on and how they can contribute to it. But here, at least the way it started off in Egypt, it had no agenda. They had no clear agenda, they had no leadership, and they had no goals. And that's why you had a large number of radical groups in Syria, paid by different countries and working to their own agendas. So, of course, that is where they ended up with the first opposition coming in Daraa, and then it went on. Now, one can say that the opposition was treated extremely harshly, and that probably was the reason why it spread so quickly around the country. The other point I'd like to mention here is the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Now, in early 2016, the OPCW, the Chemical Weapon Convention body, destroyed stockpiles of chemical weapons that Syria had. But nevertheless, until the end of 2018, 350 separate incidents were recorded of use of chemical weapons by both sides. That is, and the chemical weapons in this case mostly was chlorine. And it's become part of the fighting that goes on. As you know, the use of chemical weapons has been, apart from the destruction of ISIS, the use of chemical weapons in Syria has been the second major issue as far as the United States is concerned. And while Obama drew red lines, He didn't do anything about it. But of course, Trump did respond by attacking Syria in different parts on the use of chemical weapons. The fourth point that I'd make is the foreign interference. Now there are two things. One is the media, foreign media, and the second is the countries. Let me start with the countries. Now, as I mentioned, you have France, UK, US, and Russia on the ground in Syria. Only, of the regional parties, you have Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, and Israel. Only Iran and Russia were invited by Syria in order to assist them with with helping them to take their country back. Iran entered in 2013 and Russia in 2015. But each of them has had different agendas. Turkey, of course, wanted a role in Syria, still wants a role in Syria under some kind of neo-Ottomanism under Erdogan. The aim is to destroy the PKK and resettle 2 million refugees in the buffer zone he's planning to create along the Syria-Turkey border. He has also used Syrian fighters in countries like Libya and now in Nagorno-Karabakh. So that use of fighters which are like sort of funded by Turkey has not stopped. Saudi Arabia has got involved, did get involved, mainly because it wanted, in all this business of the Arab revolutions, what Saudi wanted to do was to divert attention from their own country, which is the most fragile. Israel, of course, has committed its first enemy, in their first line of opposition is Iran, and they're committed that till Iran is in Syria, they will continue to attack Irani facilities in Syria. Some of these facilities have been moved to the Iraq-Syria border on the Deir ez-Zor side, but nevertheless, it doesn't stop, and it will not stop. US, I already said, both Obama and Trump have kept low key basically on Syria because it was their assessment that it doesn't really affect directly the United States interests. I mentioned about how they reacted to the use of chemical weapons. I personally feel that President Biden would also continue the same thing. Take the same stand based on the fact that, according to the U.S. assessment, no primary U.S. interest is involved in Syria. The rest of it, how long he wants to keep, there are about 500 U.S. troops in Syria, but which are neither satisfactory to the Americans nor to anybody else there. UK, of course, again, is concerned greatly with the use of chemical weapons, and of course was shaken once there were ISIS-related terrorist incidents in the UK. France, on its side, has got involved mainly because of its general perception that France is a great power, and it must. Secondly, it was that it must support the Sunni Arabs, the Sunni Arab states, as far as in order to keep their weapons in order to keep their market for weapons going. So that is a reason why France has taken up the issue of Syria and got involved with it. So as you can see, all powers have pursued their own agendas or through their own proxies in Syria, totally unmindful of the Syrian people. Now, as far as the international media is concerned, as I mentioned, Al Jazeera can be blamed for actually fabricating incidents in order to show that there was all sorts of things going on. They have been actually, for some time, I think Syria has even banned Al Jazeera in the country. Similarly, MBC, the Saudi channel, and also Asharq, they have also been following, obviously, the intention and the motivation of the countries where they are based. And unfortunately, these, especially Al Jazeera, has become the source for a lot of information that is internationally being purveyed. Much of it may be wrong. So this is the second, this is the more important point to remember. Now, the next point is the peace process. The UN has worked on multiple tracks in Geneva, Vienna, and Astana. The United States Security Council Resolution 2254 of 2015 was unanimously adopted, the only one unanimously adopted, for a Syrian-owned, Syrian-led peace process to build a credible, inclusive, and a non-sectarian framework. If you just compare it with what happened in the US, where there was only what happened in Afghanistan, where there's only the US involved, or in Iraq, where there was no such unanimous Security Council resolution, it will be clear that at least this one bit was positive as far as how Syria is to be settled. But how is it to be settled? One doesn't know. What will be the post scenario like? I think nothing can happen till there's de-escalation and an enduring ceasefire. There also has to be assured that there is no further territorial partition of which cuts Syrian land, as for example what President Erdogan intends to do on the 3-mile buffer zone that he's creating. Then the other most important part, and what is most immediately visible as far as Syria is concerned, is the huge number of people who are displaced. 11 million out of the population, pre-war population, about half of the pre-war population, and out of whom more than 5 million are refugees, mostly in Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. So how are these people to be brought back? What the facilities need to be created, for which you need a massive amount of investment. The estimate that I quite accept is around $700 billion will be needed in order to something to happen. And $700 billion cannot be achieved unless there is an international consensus by the main country, especially the permanent members of the Security Council, that it's time now for them to build, rather than to build all that they have destroyed. Because after all, they have all gone through 10 years and have now come to, it's clear that removing President Assad is no longer feasible and not even thought of and by any of the countries. So what is the way in which it can be assured that the monies can be made available? Then the border crossings need to be secured. Lebanon, unfortunately, is not in a very good position at this time, economic position, and the effect of that crisis needs to be also considered. What is actually needed in terms of infrastructure is the rebuilding of hospitals, of roads, of schools, the conservation of water supply, and the fact that parallel economies have been created in the NEC, and northern Syria and Italy. So these kind of dealt with. Meanwhile, of course, if there is not enough problem, there is a high level of fatality from COVID. Um, but above all, what also needs to be simultaneously done, most of these need to be simultaneously handled once you have an enduring ceasefire, is to create a political structure for the country on which some kind of a package is possible. Fortunately, at the end of January 21, that's 2 months ago, there has been a meeting of the Syrian Constitutional Committee of about 40 members in Geneva. We have no report. I have not seen any report on exactly what happened, but at least they haven't broken up and have agreed to meet again. Now, how does one get to the point where one wants to go? So Russia, I think, in my own view, Russia can play a major role to work out a minimum acceptable agreement in the Security Council. It's a huge challenge, but nevertheless, needs to be done. But on what basis does one actually move forward? Here, I felt that a kind of a treaty which guarantees Syria's independence and so on the lines of the Treaty of 1960, the Treaty of Guarantee on Cyprus, which had been guaranteed by Cyprus, Greece, Turkey, and UK. Similarly, if one had such a treaty of which the guarantors were all the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, we may be able to get somewhere. Then, of course, in considering how this is to be done, in my book I mentioned which are the constitutions which can be used in order to, and the methods of election if one has to go ahead. But an important thing to remember is that the Sunnis, who are nearly 65-70% of the population, will need some kind of a guarantee in the constitution. And so the sectarian dimension of this problem needs to be also dealt with. And I've already said that the resources for rebuilding the country have to be a joint effort by most of the developed countries who have been responsible for what has happened. So what becomes clear out of this is that Syria's future is no longer, while we would all like Syria to decide its own future, but the way the situation is poised, it is difficult for Syria alone to decide its own future. Even though every refugee that I likely to be able to do such a thing or initiate such a thing is Russia. I had the opportunity to speak about this to a gentleman called Mr. Yakunin. I don't know if you've heard of him, Vladimir Yakunin, who is very close to President Putin. And I told him that, this is what should be your responsibility. He was initially very skeptical about it. He said, if we do something, the West will again criticize us. I said, no, but use it to change your image. You have the power to do this, or at least to start something so that the Security Council members come on to the same wavelength. Anyway, I did check some of the things that were said by President Putin after that. And I thought that I could sense that there was some idea that Russia could do something about this. Now, then the next thing is the last point I'll make is that as far as President Assad is concerned, there's a double dilemma for him and for Syria. Because only political, economic, and social reorganization will prevent continuing of the civil war. And presently, we can see that the problem of the civil war is becoming different. With first Turkey becoming more and more aggressive. Secondly, with the ISIS still gaining weight, although it doesn't have any land as such, but it's gone back to its missionary zeal. So there is that. And you're finding, of course, in Idlib that the HTS is very much active and working with both sides. So the fighting still goes on in certain parts. So, but you need political, economic, and social reorganization. But if indeed you put this in, it's quite possible that it may shorten President Assad's staying power. So there is a bargain here involved, which needs to be worked on. At the present time, of course, as I mentioned, situation is very bad, mainly because there's an increase in the attacks by Israel. There are other groups, few groups that are still fighting. Idlib still remains unresolved. There is a point in this that perhaps there's a message here to the American President Biden to look at doing carefully what he wants to do, which is to open the channel for redoing the nuclear agreement with Iran. So that could be one reason. So I think I will stop here because I may have spoken for 20 minutes, I'm not sure, but probably have. And leave it for questions or elaboration as it comes up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abhyankar. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Fazlur Rahman, for the initial introduction. Ambassador Abhyankar, the author of the book under discussion today, Mr. Bhagavan, DG ICWA, Mr. Vail Awad, Mr. Varghese George, Ms. Priya Singh, all co-panelists, ladies and gentlemen who have tuned in. Welcome to the discussion on the book, Syria, the Tragedy of a Pivotal State by Mr. R.M. Abhyankar. I'd like to thank the author for his lucid presentation so far. He has given us a clear idea of the importance of Syria in the regional context, what has happened in Syria over the last decade, the involvement of other countries in Syria, as also what lies ahead, what can be done to move the process forward towards peace. Mr. Abhyankar spent over a decade in that region, including, I think, 4 years or so as ambassador to Syria, and later handled relations with that region from headquarters as secretary. He has been following the developments in Syria and the region keenly since his retirement. He is extremely knowledgeable about the political dynamics of the region, as also the cultural and religious nuances of the region, which comes out quite clearly in the book and which helps us understand what's happening there. Syrian unrest is almost a decade old now. It's just a month short. But there is hardly any publication that gives an objective assessment of the developments and the situation. This book successfully fills this gap. My compliments to the author for his informative and excellent book. I was posted in Syria from January 2011 to December 2012. It was a wonderful place to be in till trouble started in March 2011. I was witness to what happened there in the first 2 years of the unrest, and I have been following the development since then, but not as closely as the author. First, let me speak a few words about the situation in Syria in March 2011. Unlike in some other countries in the Middle East, Syria had no serious social, economic, sectarian, or unemployment problem at that time. There was, however, no serious political opposition because the political system was centered on the Baath party, and that was not conducive to the functioning of any other political party. There were fault lines in the society, but most groups had worked out a modus vivendi with the government. What got Syria into trouble was its foreign policy, that is, close relations with Russia, Iran, support for Palestinian cause, etc. The author has flagged some points which, in my view, could have been responsible for the regime's survival. These are: Assad had the support of key elements of Syrian society. Syria was the only country in the Middle East to have a secular polity. And the third point was the army was a diverse one in which every sect can hope to rise to the top position. If proof was needed of this last point, it is provided in the incident, bomb blast incident of, I think, July 2012, in which the defense minister, a Christian, assistant vice president, a Turkoman, both were killed. And there were casualties of other sects also, Alawites and Sunnis. And President's brother-in-law and Deputy Defense Minister, Asif Shaukat, also was killed in that incident. I don't think you will come across such a diverse sort of people handling security-related issues at the topmost level in any other country. In fact, the person who replaced the defense minister was a Sunni from Rastan, which at that time was the headquarters of the terrorists. The outside powers that chose to intervene ignored all these critical factors. This despite the fact that in the assessment of Western ambassadors resident in Damascus, Assad enjoyed the support of 80% of the population of Syria, 80% of the people of Syria. This cannot be said of any leader elected through the democratic process in any other country. I'm not referring to the usual periodic 99% or 99.9% endorsement that some leaders get or in some places, where one party controls the system. I'm talking about the assessment of the Western diplomats resident in Syria, about people's support for Assad. Syria is yet another case where outside forces plunged in without an objective assessment of the ground situation, without clarity on the end point, as also on the means for achieving the same. Each player looked at Syria through their own chosen prism. The Gulf looked at Syria through the sectarian prism. The West used the prism of their style of democracy. The regime saw it through the prism of survival in the midst of external intervention. All of them failed to look at the situation in Syria through the prism of people's desires, aspirations, and their choices. The end result is the untold sufferings of the people of Syria, which they seem to dismiss as collateral damage. The developments in the region and the quick overthrow of some leaders led Syria's foes to believe that a regime change could be possible in Syria. They started working towards it. Initial support was tepid, but with active material, moral, and political support from the Gulf,
they pumped the billions of dollars. Even the Hamad bin Jassim, the former prime minister of Qatar, he himself acknowledged $137 billion spent to topple the regime of Syria. And it was on a BBC interview, and everybody can browse to it and find it out. So a regime change policy was very much on the card in Syria to destroy, and that is what we have seen that they have tried to do, as Wensley said, the general, a former US general who said, Wesley, he himself said there were 7 countries that to be toppled, and Syria was one of those countries, including Libya and also Yemen and Iran on the later. But that is what I was trying to mention here. So I think this point we will focus about the Dara issues and how the things have started, how the Syrian President Assad have percent of my army. I will be sectarian in my talk. 92% of the Syrian army are Sunnis. We have more than 75% of the jobs of the cabinet ministers are Sunnis. We have every representative of Syria was a minister, a cabinet minister, or representative in Syria. The Alawite, which we talk in Syria, the Alawite themselves, 2.5% of the population. Out of the 2.5% of the population, only 0.05% of the Alawite are benefiting from the regime, from the government. And you have traveled in Latakia, Ambassador Haran. You've seen the poverty on the way. You have seen the people, the village, the peasants. They are mostly from the tribe of the president. But they are not into lavish life. Those who stole the country, those who have been the elite of the power of the country, have hidden their money abroad. There is no money for them in Syria, except maybe a castle they built, maybe they have built a house. You can see a unique house of a corrupted officers, yes, inside those areas, but you cannot get their money. Most of the money are kept in the foreign bank where they have frozen and everybody knows about it. I'm not going to speak on those lines, but I'm very happy to see that you have elaborated a lot about the Syrian history, the Syrian, the structure of the government. You talk of insurgency. Insurgency in Syria in your chapter 3 also you did mention a lot about the Syrian insurgency and its aftermath. According to UN, Ambassador, UN also have come up with a figure, and UN agency also, they have 137,400 terrorists came from 83 nations. and they were in Syria and in Iraq, and 25% of them have been killed. Still, we have 55,000 of them inside Idlib, where Erdogan is using them as his mercenaries army everywhere, and they are going back to Europe, and they are also smuggled, some of them, along with the Syrian refugees. So we can understand the wider pictures of why Erdogan have involved in the Syrian war from day one, to use the Syrian refugees, not to settle them in northern part of Syria. The pretext of fighting Kurdistan or the PYG is only simply a pretext to occupy more territory of Syria. Because if you look at the map, he has been playing last month also, the Turkey themselves, about Erdogan, the Turkey extension. You will see that half of Syria, if not nothing of Syria left, it is all under Turkey, never even call it Syria. If you look at the Kurdistan map, which has also been taught in school, in the curriculum, you will see not only the northern part of Syria, not even till Latakia, they have got the extension up to Latakia and to the Mediterranean Sea from Syria, Iraq, Turkey and all. So everybody have an ambition to chop off Syria into pieces and annex it and take it on its own. That's why we have everybody, the whole world have come to Syria to fight Syria, to kill the Syrian, and to make sure that half of the population is out of the country, while either internally or externally being displaced. So the insurgency continue, and the reason for continuity of the insurgency is to make sure that Syria will never recover for generations to come. So the dominance of our neighbor Israel will remain as a major card, because there is no question of giving a Palestinian state. They are annihilating Palestine, they are jailing them, they are annexing the land. So there is no way that there will be a solution or a peace in the region. So therefore, creating cantons of countries, extremist Sunni state, Alawite state, Druzi state, Shia, Kurdi, Sunni, this goes part of Israel tomorrow declaring itself as a Jewish state, and that is where the whole objective of the American foreign policy in the region. And that is why Ambassador Harad, America is trying to stay back in Syria, and they are building a new airport in Deir ez-Zor, and that's also a clear indication that creating a Kurdish enclave in the northern eastern part of Syria is part of the major objective of the United States, to create a Kurdistan also, and not only to create, but also to blackmail Turkey in the future, because Erdogan, as a regional power, has been expanding at the cost of the American objective, where he has crossed his limit, where the Americans have given him free hand, either in Syria or in Azerbaijan, Karabakh, or whether it's in Libya, whether it's in the Mediterranean Sea. So there is a question of Erdogan clipping his wings is the only way, is by creating a war zone for him in the heart of Syria, where he will always claim that there is a Syria and Iraq, where the Kurdish forces are using against Turkey, and he has a reason to go and occupy both the countries. And he's a reason to go because they have always eyed Mosul in Iraq, they eyed Idlib, Aleppo in Syria, and they will work on that to annihilate and annex this part of Syria. So we will look at it. Assad presidency, in your chapter 4, you talked about longevity and Trump accessibility. And I think I don't want to speak much about it because you have elaborated a few pages on this, which is also Assad may go for the new election. I think with his popularity, as he's been enjoying more than 80% of the population, I can say yes, he will go for the election, and there are going to be election this year. So we are expecting this. And whoever compete with him, I'm sure there is no alternative except Abu Julani, which they have been the Tahrir al-Sham. He's now been promoted by the US as the new face of the Syrian presidents could be. So we know that what the main reason for projecting a terrorist as an alternative to the current government. So let's see what the ballot will decide. Regional powers, I've spoke because you spoke about Turkey, Iran, I think Turkey, Iran, and Russia. This Turkey, we have given enough. Saudi Arabia, by the way, Saudi Arabia, you did mention a lot in your writing about Saudi Arabia's role in the regional powers. Saudi Arabia, we knew from day one they were a good relation with Turkey when Turkey was needed to get into Syria, all the mercenaries or all the weapons to destroy the country. And I believe we had, according to our own information, we have more than 24,500 Saudi nationals who have been in Syria involved with the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and they have been doing all the destruction, the suicidal operation, as they have been doing even inside Iraq. And even the CIA data, if you go to it, you will find out that 55% of most of the suicidal who have blown up themselves in Iraq were Saudi nationals. So the Takfiri Wahhabi culture is being trying to promote in Syria as an alternative to secular Syria. We understand the Saudi game plan. Now, it's not an anti-Iran, by the way. It's not an anti-Iran if somebody trying to project it into Sunni Shia. At this stage, not at this stage, maybe in later stage, because Iran is being given at the platter, golden platter, whether it is Iraq, whether it is Syria, whether it is Lebanon, whether it is Yemen. It is all done on behalf of the United States and the Saudi Arabia, who have been trying to give the alternative to the current governments in this country in the hand of Iran, where they can do and interfere in the future planning for these countries. And I know, and everybody knows what is happening, why now they are coming back in term, because Biden is trying to collaborate and come back covered, sending the Qatari minister into Iran to settle the issue of the Iranian nuclear deal and maybe come back in terms. But at the end of the day, it is the Arab, it is the Syrian who is paying the price, and we are paying with our own money, with our own blood, with our own territories. And the war is happening in our own territories. So Iran all the way is benefiting, whether from Syria as a regional power, whether it is from its own influence, its own expansion of the region because of it is under different sanctions, but they have played a major role in stabilizing Syria along with the Russian. 2015, it was the turning point where we see the Russian have taken the major part in playing a vital role in stabilizing the government. And it's only the time where President Putin told the American there is no regime change in Syria and they're going to be a Syrian president has to stay, and the Russians stayed and expanded their military bases in Syria, because we had a military pact with the USSR, which has been extended to Russia, and they have got enough years to stay till to 2050. So we don't have a problem with the Russians staying. So the government of Syria will not be removed by force, as long as Putin have said no to it. We have seen also the international effort toward peace. I think this is a good chapter, chapter 6. Ambassador, in your book, you have talked about the UN initiatives, you have talked about the peace process and the Syrian, for the Syrians and all. And I think just a point I wanted to put on this was the peace process itself is at fault. It's a faulty, because the Syrian government did not fall. They tried all means to topple the Syrian government. They failed. So they said the only way out is to bring a peace process on the table. But who wants peace? Till date, we don't see anybody want peace. None of the parties wanted peace, by the way. Everybody is enjoying the Syrian war. Everybody is benefiting from the Syrian war. So as long as it continue, we continue to suffer. The people of Syria destroyed. The country in a very bad shape economically. It is politically, it is stable, yes. Security-wise, it's still not. But people are standing in long queue for fuel, standing for food. Even at the time of COVID-19, people are crying, people are resenting against the government. And I think the reason for this is to make sure that President Assad does not enjoy more popularity among the Syrian people when the election time comes, if an election has to be held in Syria. Because that is the main objective. You cannot, a government where they used to give more than 60% of the government jobs, 60% of the Syrian population were already employed by the Syrian government. You had the agricultural land, you had the oil, self-reliance. Syria was able to survive. And despite the fact that you may have a salary of 30,000 rupees, but your expenditure is 1 lakh rupees a month, still Syrian people could survive and enjoy. That is where we have the problem. Maybe few corruption is there, but we do not have to destroy the history of Syria to change a regime politically. Politically can be fought for years. We learned from Gandhiji that non-violence can be also be achieving your own aim. But we failed to do it in any Arab country because we ourselves love to destroy each other. We are very much against each other. We enjoy destroying. We enjoy removing history. You know, that's a part that this is the painful memory of our history of interfighting among the Arabs. And there where the involvement of the Arabs have been pouring money just to keep on destroying, irrespective of who we are killing. So this is what we have seen. So the peace process in Syria will never succeed as long as your own creations of opposition. I know most of the opposition leaders whom I have worked with them and I have seen them, whom they have not even had a house in France to sleep on exile. They've been given 5-star hotel treatment. They are having $50 million in their account now. I know their account also. If time permit, I will give you everybody account. How many houses they are having now? This is opposition? Is the way of solving the Syrian crisis? By creating an opposition? This is the problem. The problem is we need to understand the deep root of the problem of Syria. It is the geopolitical location of Syria and the interest of American and the Chinese and the Turkish and the Iranian in the Syrian presence. It is the Silk Route, end of the Silk Route is Syria. It is the Israeli expansion that they wanted Euphrates and Nile. It is the Mediterranean presence. It is the meeting of the Africa, Europe and Asia is Syria as the end meeting point. So it is an important state and we are paying the price. We understand. We survived for 10,000 years. We will continue to survive. We may not be able to take our own decision at this stage, but definitely in the coming years, we will come back and everybody has to go out. American cannot stay in Syria forever, nor any foreign troops can stay in Syria forever, nor Turkey can enjoy a peace because the next country to fall apart is going to be Turkey. No matter what we may talk about it, no matter how strong it is the American who is making an internal destruction of Turkey, leading it into own conflict within itself because it's a heterogeneous society. It has been living on the cost of destroying other country. And I'm sure if Erdogan remain in power, as much as he remain, the fast fall of Turkey will be the sooner to the Turk. So I am very happy to read your book, Ambassador, and I am just closely my topic here because I exceeded my time. I am sure we will work it out in the Arabic translation, and I will be happy to be myself doing this job for you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Awad. I think for a person sitting in Delhi or somewhere in India, I think they kept track of the finer details of what happened in the initial stages of the uprising in Syria. That's very creditable. You mentioned that Qatar had spent $137 billion on the Syrian uprising or Syrian revolution, whatever you want to call it. I hope they'll give an equal amount to the Syrian government once the situation stabilizes for reconstruction of Syria. You also mentioned about the targeting of Christians. I still recall one very pathetic incident which I had to witness. One Armenian almost pleading, what crime did we commit? 100 years back, Turkey threw us out from there, and we came here. And over the last 50 years, we've been able to stabilize ourselves. We have established our business, etc. Now we are again forced to leave this place. I remember the initial stages, people in Aleppo, the Armenians in Aleppo, everybody queued up in front of the Armenian mission and took visas just to run in case the situation worsens. In fact, many of them left ultimately. Now we'll move on because we are already behind time. The next speaker would be Mr. Verghese George. He is Deputy Resident Editor of The Hindu, and you will have 15 minutes to make your presentation. Thank you. Unmute yourself, please. Unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador Haran. Thank you, Mr. Awad. That was a passionate case that you made on what's happening in Syria. Dr. Rahman, Madam Singh, and the other Ambassador Abhyankar. I think we must all be very grateful to you for bringing your scholarship, erudition, and practical wisdom into this book. Because Syria, at one level, it is not a very likely topic for a commentary by an Indian author. I would say a lot of the books that we have here these days primarily focus on China, the United States, Pakistan. I am myself an author on a book on the United States, drawing from my own experience living there as the correspondent for The Hindu between 2015 and 2018. In fact, my observations in the following few minutes will also draw from my own interactions with the US State Department on the questions of Syria. I think that is a period that you discuss in this book also, some of the US-Russia relationship and US's own role here. So the Syria in many sense is an unlikely topic for an Indian author, but I think this has been a worthwhile pursuit that you did. In fact, Dr. Rahman would recall that perhaps I think both of us heard Mr. Awad for the first time during our JNU days in the early 2000s. So he's not lost the passion even a little bit from then till date. So the fact that you, people like you, Mr. Ambassador Abhyangar, and even I would even mention Ambassador Raghavan's recent book on Pakistan, when you combine your practical wisdom with your scholarship, that actually makes very lovely reading, very perceptive, informative, and provocative at times. So the last couple of days that I spent reading through these pages, it opened my eyes to many layers of understanding and the explanations that you provide. You call it the tragedy of a pivotal state. Both words are very operative. It is a tragedy, it is pivotal, not only from Syria's own perspective or the region's perspective, I would say, from the perspective of the entire world, and for any multi-ethnic society, and including India. Glad that you mentioned in your presentation. I do not think you made that parallel in the book, but I think that is very relevant in understanding where we stand. So I greatly enjoyed the book, and it is. I wish the book all success, and you as an author all the success at this time. So I have a few observations to make, which is not getting into the details about the events or your own analysis of the events that are unraveling in Syria as we speak. Slightly diverting from what you said, you make these observations in broadly two categories. One is the domestic dimensions of the Syrian crisis, and the other part is the international angle, the world order, and the international actors at play, the foreign countries that are being involved. The first set of issues that you raise, that is the domestic reasons and the context of the crisis in Syria. What are the questions? I mean, it appeared very fascinating to me, the questions through these events and analysis of Syria and Syria's own struggles with its contemporary history. We have questions that are relevant to people in India and any place where we have a multinational, multi-religious society, how to organize itself. And what are the limits of democratic mobilization? When we say democracy, how does one discover the majority in a society? Is religion or sect, which actually makes a permanent marker of a majority, of identity of a majority, that actually precludes and all other possible negotiations, dynamism in the negotiation that becomes a part of democracy. Because the moment you make a religion or a sect as the primary tool of mobilization, there is no further scope for negotiating a democracy, because that becomes a permanent, non-negotiable attribute. There is nothing much to negotiate. And when you see attempts on those lines in other parts where there is functional democracies, we know where those societies could be heading towards. Here again, as all of you pointed out, the speakers before me, the question here is not that the Sunnis are excluded from governance. The question here is more about, the grievance is more about the fact that the Sunnis are not accepted as Sunnis as a majority. As Ambassador Abhyangar points out, the current dispensation is in a way a coalition of the minorities. We have seen coalition of minorities in many parts of the world, including in India. The UPA coalition was actually in many ways a coalition of the minorities. Then you have reactions of various, and you mentioned, you express your reservation about calling it the Arab Spring. So there we have the origins of some misconceptions about what democracy could entail. If it is all about mobilizing, is there a difference between mobocracy and democracy? And also in this particular context, we are also we are confronted with the question of what is a democratic mobilization and what is terrorism. Actually, what point does it become terrorism? In this very book, you sort of explain and outline the same set of people would be considered as freedom fighters by the US policy, could be considered terrorists by Turkey. So it is a constantly dynamic situation. And when we jump at labeling one group as a democratic mobilization and another group as terrorist, or vice versa, there is a dilemma to be resolved. And what happens in Syria is actually a stark reminder of that fact, and a cautionary tale to all of us, and you bring that point very vividly in the book. And another very fascinating point, which again you may not be describing that in that fashion in the book, but it comes across in that manner to me, is that how the national boundaries have become fussy when there is a new attempt at consolidating a national identity, where on the periphery, at the geographical boundaries of an existing nation state, when it becomes more volatile, and their own loyalty and patriotism become suspect, and it unleashes a whole lot of political forces within the national boundaries and opens up space for foreign intervention. Some of it could be very, very dangerous and violent, as we witness in Syria. And of course, all this happens at a huge humanitarian cost in terms of displacement, destruction, and death. So you make the point, Ambassador Abhyankar, this can be resolved only if a new viable structure of governance were to be found in Syria. Yet again, that applies not only to Syria, to all places which have a similar make in terms of social diversity, in terms of religion, language, and culture that applies. You call for there has to be, if there is a new constitution to emerge, and it will call for significant compromises from all people who are involved, which we can only hope at this moment that there will be from elements within the Syrian society and the power structure. The second set of issues that you deal with is about the global players who are involved in the United States. Here, I think I would emphasize the role of the United States, and particularly the role of the US-Russia relationship. How this has been a very determining factor in how the crisis in Syria has unfolded. I recall this is also a crisis within the United States on defining what it is fighting for in different theaters of the world. Between 2015 and 2018, when I was very closely covering that part of the thing, it was very evident within the US system. There were arguments. I mean, there was an interesting headline which I still remember, which was about a group which was financed and supported by the CIA was fighting another group which was supported and funded by the Pentagon. So such was the confusion within the US system. There were conflict between the Pentagon and the State Department and various other US agencies who were all financing and supporting multiple groups that were fighting. And the Indians' antipathy towards Russia, which still remains a defining feature of the US establishment, is actually been a curse for the Syria and how this crisis. I mean, what if, as you mentioned in the book, if a viable solution were to be found, Russia's role is very important. If Russia were to find that, okay, this is how we will settle, we will be willing for a settlement on this issue, I think that will also take a certain concession or an accommodation by the United States to accept what Russia might want and how it could be. Otherwise, as we stand today, if I mean, again, though you make the point that from Biden administration to Trump administration, there was a continuity in the US policy. I agree with that on the outcome, but I would add this part that for all his fault, Trump was one person who rejected the idea that regime change and this wholesale promotion of democracy is part of US policy or even in US interest. He questioned that premise. And while condemning Trump is become a cottage industry around the world, I would actually give him credit for accepting the fact that US's enthusiastic interventionism all over the world has done more, perhaps it's done more harm to those regions and to the US's own interests as well. So I think what we will all have to be watching out should be whether, Putin has actually offered a kind of a new framework for US-Russia partnership. He stated more than once that like the US and the Soviet Union faced up to the challenge of Nazi as a united bloc. Here we have a global challenge of extremism, which we can actually find an agreement upon. Trump was open to that idea, but the US establishment did not allow him to proceed on that ground. Now, when Biden administration comes, he has made noises which are actually sort of disturbing for Russia and friends of Russia in the region. We will have to see how that goes forward. If actually he throws back into a very anti-Russia format of understanding the world, I think our agonies in West Asia is going to last. So that is one point which I wanted to flag. So also Syria, the way you've narrated the Syria question, also actually exposes or unravels the challenge to the new US idea of the world as a theater of great power rivalry. So there is a very concerted attempt in the US security commentaries to sort of understand the world and present it as a new rivalry where the US, you have to be with us or you have to be against us. If that is a path that the US wants to pursue, I think this is a classic theater where that is not playing out. Turkey being the classic case, where Turkey is playing all sides. They are part of the NATO alliance on the one hand. They can be getting the S-400 from Russia on the other, and they are a partner who is not very easy to manage. So the point being that the international involvement in in Syria, as you narrate in this book, also vividly actually brings out the limited options that the world powers have in trying to carve out the world into their own powers of influence or blocks. And it also, without stating, emphasize the reason why there has to be compromises, not only within Syria, but at an international level among world powers, if you are actually committed to security and peace. And finally, if at all there were to be a kind of global understanding of new alliances, what it could be. So here again, you point out the irony or the paradox of a theocratic state of Iran being the real or the only protector or a friend of a secular pluralist establishment, regardless of what faults it may have. That itself actually shows up whether a sectarian religiosity or religious ideology could be the only reason why two countries could be together, or a civilizational alliance is the only way to forward, or there could be anything better than that. So these are the few observations that I had when I went through this book with a lot of interest and fascination. In many ways, Syria is a metaphor of the crisis, not only of the region, but it's a crisis in liberalism and the liberal international order, what we've called. Everybody has a stake in it, and so we in India, I think we have a lot to observe and learn from what is happening there and adapt ourselves to the situation. So as I said in the beginning, usually we end up, we think that the only relationships that we have a stake in are China, Pakistan, and the United States. By bringing this volume out, I think you have done a great service to people who are keen observers and students of international relations and how global scenario is changing. Thank you for that effort, and many congratulations, and I wish you a great success for this book, which I am sure it will be. Thank you again for this opportunity, Dr. Rahman, and ICWA for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. And I'd just like to say one thing, that on your domestic issues, there is a concept of consocialization, which is a way in which you can establish a system where you ensure that the rivalries do not come to a head till such time that people have worked out their differences. It's a well-used system of how one can rearrange the political governance in a country. Second point briefly I'll make is that US-Russia, of course, with President Biden making it clear that his view on Russia is going to be very different from that of Trump, we can more or less, although I think it doesn't involve any, I still hold that Syria doesn't directly involve any US interests, but to the extent that President Biden intends to be hard on Russia, we are going to probably have some way in which the US will intensify its presence in Russia or in Syria, although it may also look at other ways in which to remove Russia from Syria. But the problem is that between Iran and Syria, although Iran has helped the Syrian government a great deal, between Iran and Syria, the peace, the aggression of Iran has been kept in check by the Russians while they are in Syria. So that's something that I'm sure the Syrian government will not be very keen to have the Russians go and only the Iranians. So these just two brief points, but thank you very much for your very interesting comments.
Thank you, Mr. Verghese George. You mentioned about the grievances of Sunnis not being accepted, the majority Sunni community. But I was there physically present, and I had traveled quite widely in Syria, met a wide cross-section of people. I never got an impression that they had any serious grievances. Grievances that can't be settled through dialogue. And Assad was one person who was engaged with all sections of the community. So I don't think the Syrian government can be faulted on that question. You underlined the necessity of significant compromises, both from within Syria and also by outside players for finding a way forward. Yes, I agree with you. You also mentioned about the different strands of view in the US administration. Yes, that was quite visible in Syria also. If you recall, the very first week after things broke out, I had clear information, evidence that CIA was already sending supplies from Lebanon into Latakia region on to Idlib and Aleppo. But you had the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, saying publicly that representatives from both sides of the aisle, that means Democrats and Republicans, tell me that Assad is a reformer, basically saying that we are not going to get that deeply involved right now. But on the other hand, even when she was saying this, it was US was already sending in supplies. Anyway, I'll not go into details. I thought I'll mention these 2-3 points. Now I'm giving the floor to Ms. Priya Singh for 15 minutes. She's Associate Director, Asia and Global Affairs, Kolkata. Floor is yours.
Good evening. Thank you, Ambassador Haran. And thank you to the Indian Council of World Affairs for having me here. Ambassador Abhyankar, thank you very much for this wonderful piece of work. It's a very serious, tragic subject, and using the word enjoyed would actually be demeaning it, but actually it was a very, very enriching reading. There were the first thing that struck me was the sequence of it, the way the book has been organized, in the sense, the interplay between local, national, regional, and the global theater, and with almost equal weightage to all these factors, which is really commendable. And I actually enjoyed the fact that you call it pivot, which it has been, but generally the last couple of decades we've seen a plethora of literature on Central Asia using Mackinder's pivot theory of pivot. And it's nice to actually find its usage in the Syrian context, and particularly the rather telling impact of saying that it continues to be a focus or a pivot, but in a regressive sense, in the sense it's like a septic focus now. I found that to be really glaring, it was disconcerting, but then the regression of it continues to be a pivot, but it's regressed into that. And yes, as my co-panelist, Mr. George, just specified, living in India, it was so, it was spontaneous to bring about, the parallels that one finds in the Syrian scenario and in India. I was particularly engrossed in the chapter when you talked about its, the internal dynamics and the intersectionality that was emphasized upon, the way identity politics plays out. And you talked about, you've constantly specified on the fact that how heterogeneous it is, how heterogeneous the social fabric is, and yet the political culture of it constantly harping on the homogeneous aspect, which is so similar to what probably we are familiar with that here as well. And my question is, has this been counterproductive? In the sense that, we've talked, there is a strong force. Even though Dr. Awad says, and you've repeated that in the book, that Assad enjoys tremendous popularity, and I'm sure it's the fact, it is factual. But then, there are rumblings and churnings everywhere. The very fact that is this, harping on the homogeneity, though there is a great deal of diversity and heterogeneity, this paradox, how does it play? I mean, even though it could be just in the realm of rhetoric, has this also been, one of the factors which has, brought this, these two, this debate between, the majority and the minority? The contradictory forces. But the other factor that is really interesting, you constantly talk about the deep state, the state which has, kind of permeated every aspect of the individual's life. But it is, when you talk about the state, it is also state education. Now, I would probably like to point out a couple of areas where I thought one could really, focus on, since this book otherwise is an extremely comprehensive work. Now, when you talked about the civil war and its impact on education and health, so one of the things that strikes me is that, the education which must have been, a state education, what happens now, particularly when there is a category of refugees who at some point in time will again, come back to the state, and there is going to be surplus labor. You will have a kind of education system, and which has been uprooted to a great extent, has been, affected if not uprooted. And this, this kind of a gap between employment and, the kind of education that has been provided, this question, particularly with reference to the refugees, how would one address this gap between, education and employment? The other thing is, when you're talking about the changes in the global scenario, the changes in the American presidency, also the change, the absolute explicit change in France that has taken place over the years, and whether this would, further deepen the stereotyping of refugees and its impact on the Syrian state is something that, attracts me. The other thing is, what about China? I kind of admire the fact that almost every regional global power has been kind of mentioned. What about China and China's role in the reconstruction process? Particularly because Syria is very much a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and I think as late as November 2020, I think there was a conference which talked about, going back to the 5 C's strategy where Syria would act as, the connecting node between Black Sea, Caspian Sea, Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean. So, this kind of alliance between China, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Russia. This is something that I would definitely like to bring in China here and its role in the entire reconstruction process. Finally, what really intrigues me is, as Syria, and rightly so, becomes the center stage of the debates around the region, the Palestinian issue is probably being further sidelined or relegated. So this entire discourse on Syria brings into the forefront a number of issues. The local, it's almost like, when Dr. Awad was talking about, I think it was him who talked about the old Silk Road, and we go back to a pre-constructed globalization phase to, a phase where one talks about, post-globalization or local, and that's been very beautifully brought out. It's been global and local. But the fact of the matter remains, since you've talked about almost all the powers, you've talked about the United States and of course Russia playing a very important role, Iran in the immediate neighborhood, that having its implications, on Saudi, Iran equations, Israel of course being there. I would definitely like to see China, and particularly, with the kind of the surplus that they have, and the way they want to use it in the Belt and Road Initiative. How and where would, what would Assad's position be as far as that is concerned, and how much could he, take advantage of that? I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Priya, for your comments. Quite a few comments, but maybe there isn't time. But let me say firstly about China. The first thing to know is that China has indicated its willingness to actually get involved in the reconstruction of Syria. At the Damascus Fair, which was recently revived, China had a pavilion there, and they have made it very clear that they would be more than interested. As you know, China has gone even into Afghanistan because of mining. In Syria, there is the possibility of once again looking for oil, although they don't have that much, but they still do. So China doesn't want to get into fisticuffs, get into any kind of a military posture, but economic posture, definitely China will be there. Will be there. I don't think the Syrian government is averse to it. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. Secondly, on internal dynamics, it is true that when you actually insist on homogeneity of some kind, like as you mentioned, we are seeing it in India as well, it doesn't mean that there are no differences. The problem really is that who is prescribing the homogeneity? Do you accept the person prescribing the homogeneity as somebody who can tell you to be homogeneous? Now, the whole thing rests on that. And I leave it at that for you to come to whatever conclusion you want to. Now, as far as the Palestinian issue is concerned, it is true, it has been sidelined mainly because you see UAE and at least 4 different Arab countries have already made peace with them. Now, Syria historically called itself the bleeding heart of the Arab world, mainly because it was the Palestinian issue that was most important. Over these years, the Palestinian issue has waned, and therefore that thing, I don't think Syria can do much about it. But it is a fact of life. There's not much that one can do about it. So I'll just make these 2 comments. The others, I don't know, I think the time is short, so I will leave it there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Priya Singh. I think Mr. Abhyankar has already responded to your points. Now we'll go to we'll have I don't know how many minutes we have for question answer. Dr. Fazil?
For 10 minutes, I think 10 minutes to be.
How do there is a.
I think in the chat box, I think we have, in the chat box you can have, I have posed a question to you directly.
Yeah.
So,
okay. The question from Dr. Fazil Rahman is, you mentioned that Syrian fate does not depend on Syria, but it has become a hostage to outside. If I think right, this has been the case with all the countries passing through the crisis like Libya, Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, and the same phenomenon is everywhere. I agree with you absolutely, because outsiders are so deeply involved in these countries and also in Syria that without their involvement no solution is possible. I mean, that's a fact. I agree with you. Okay, now there are some indications here. I don't know what it is, frankly. Oh. No. Okay. Now, Ambassador Abhyankar, would you have any?
So one question I would like to ask you, Ambassador Abhyankar.
Yeah.
Sir, you talked about this Syrian army is very much non-political. But I think they may be non-political, but they are not non-sectarian, I think. Given the social structure of the Egyptian Syrian politics, sectarianism, you have mentioned in your book that what has this crisis has done, it has awakened the gene of sectarianism and all this communalism, I think. But I think gradually what happened, Syrian army has also started pursuing a kind of sectarian agenda. The way they rescued regime of Assad, if you see, the army has played a very prominent role in Libya, in Egypt, in Tunisia. They have a different role to play. But I think telling that they have been quite non-political, so I think I would like to seek explanation how they are non-political in their pursuit of rescuing the regime of Assad, and the way they have been rescued. Rather, they have sacrificed their state, they sacrificed the institution, but they rescued President Assad. So how do you see that? Just comments on that.
Well, the thing is, if you see that particular point in the book, the army is non-political in this sense. Firstly, the army was handed over to, meaning Bashar Assad took over the army, which had been really groomed and made what it is by his father, Hafiz al-Assad, and the main Mustafa Tlas, the general who was involved. And they decided that we should keep this army non-political. It doesn't mean it's non-sectarian. I'm sure, probably as Dr. Awad has said, there are a large number of Sunnis in the army, in fact, majority probably. So non-sectarian doesn't mean non-political. Non-political means an army which will not get involved in the political process, as distinct from what happened in Egypt, what happened in some of the other countries. So there is a very clear difference between non-political and non-sectarian. And more you can read in the book on this subject. Thank you.
Any other closing remarks, Mr. Abhyankar?
Well, I just want to thank everybody, particularly Dr. Awad, for the various comments he made. It probably made me feel, listening to him, that I should now write a second book on Turkey's role in Syria, where a lot of this thing will come. But meanwhile, I'm glad that he said that he will translate the book in Arabic. I look forward to it. And similarly, I was very happy with the comments made by sorry, I'm not getting Mr. Varghese, about the book and some of the points there. All of them are extremely useful. What I can do, I don't know. Maybe I'll keep them for the future. I mean, keep them to follow up in case I ever decide to write something with this angle, that how has Turkey been involved in Syria, where much of these points can come in. But it's just an idea that came to me as I'm listening to. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Vailawad, you wanted the floor?
Thank you, Ambassador. I just wanted, if you go ahead with the book, I can give you all the data of how much genocide have been committed by the Turk in Syria against minority, whether it is Alawite or Christians or Armenian, or even the Greek, where we have received refugee from Greek in 1921 and 1937. And we know how much really we have been at the receiving end of the Ottoman Empire and the de facto Khalifa now, Erdogan, who is trying to flourish himself as the replacement of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who was the face of the issues. I had 2 points to raise here, which I really wanted to mention because it was significant to mention. One is the role of the media. In fact, I wanted to just comment here, and I commend the Indian media in covering the Syrian war. In fact, there was a delegation of Indian media and a veteran journalist at the time of crisis in Syria. And in fact, they arranged a visit to Homs without even being covered by the Syrian government. They forced the Syrian government that they wanted to go and see what's going on in Homs. And most of the journalists there, they have come with the impression that this is a fabricated story because the people of Homs came down in the street. I mean, it was nothing planned. You know, when you go on trips, you think government will do everything for you. They were moving in the street. People were coming down from their houses and telling them, we do not want this Takfiri group to be in our country. We are moderate. We don't want this war. We wanted our country to be peaceful. And that was in Homs on the days of the war. And if you go to all these journalists who have written about Syria 2001, 11 and 2012, you will see where Al Jazeera and one of our friends from the Telegraph mentioned, and the Nair, I remember Casey Nair, he mentioned very well that he was sitting in the hotel and they told him there was a demonstration in Maidan and he had to go and take a taxi. So then Al Jazeera flashing breaking news, the taxi fellow was afraid to go with him and he said, I went to the town of that Syrian town around rural Damascus and it was life normal, looked like Calcutta street. So the fabrication of the media have played a major role in destabilizing Syria, and I think even the channel where I was working, and they terminated my job because of these things, because they were not able to buy me that I can sell my country to their own fake propaganda and fake news. That's why I'm proud to be a Syrian and that we stuck to our guns and we are a hard chest to be broken. That's what we are all about it. The more important point I wanted to finally to raise is the China. The China role is very important. I think if we look at the new military doctrine of China, it will give us a clear indication that a military intervention by China in the future, especially on those countries which fall on the line of the Silk Road, the 64 countries, very much on the card, because the American and the West is countering the Chinese Silk Road on these issues. And in particularly in Syria, we had 5,500 Turk Uyghurs have been staying inhabited by the Turk who have given them Turkish passport. They were inhabited inside northern part of Syria so they can change the demography of the region. They can be sent back to China where they can play a role in destabilizing the Jinping province where the Uyghur and the minority Muslim are there. And that is the idea where I always used to say terrorism is being used as a tool and to achieve a political objective. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vailawad. I agree with all that you said. You referred to media fabrications. I referred to one incident, but I have dozens of incidents like that where I was physically present in a particular place, and when something was reported about something as having happened in that area, and which was not correct because I couldn't see anything happening there. In fact, that itself could fill a full volume, if I choose to write. Anyway, we are coming to the end of the program. I'd like to thank Mr. Abhyankar and all the panelists for their valuable insights into the Syrian situation. I'd like to thank ICWA for organizing this web event, and I also would like to thank all those who have tuned in for this webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. As we have come to the end of the program, it's my pleasure to present the vote of thanks on behalf of the Council. I would like to express my gratitude to the distinguished Chair Ambassador V.P. Haran, author Ambassador Abhyankar, and eminent discussant Vailawad, Varghese Ke Jaj, and Ms. Priya Singh for making their observation My special thanks to all the invited participants for their active participation. My special thanks to leadership of the Council, Ambassador T.C. Raghavan, DG ICWA, Shri Suman Bagchi, MS Nutan Kapoor Mahavar for their support and guidance to the events. And thanks to DR for her help in conducting the program. A special thanks to IT team, without whose help it would have not been possible in the current situation. Once again, my congratulations to Ambassador Abhyankar for authoring such a wonderful book on such a relevant topic. A special thanks to DG ICWA for commencing the works. Finally, I thank all the participants and viewers who joined the program today. Now I announce the end of the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you.